often when you create, it feels like it's too easy, that you're just pulling memories out. And I've realized after reading Neuroscience that that's a misunderstanding of what memory is. So I'm drawing on the work of Leanne Gabor, a contemporary neuroscientist, who explains what she calls the magic of creativity by the architecture, the marvelous architecture of memory. And I want to try and explain that to you because it's very exciting for us as creators. So, what she says is that any experience that we have gets stored in a whole lot of neurons, many, many neurons. And these neurons are particular about what they store because some of them are sensitive to, say, horizontal lines. And some of them are sensitive to the colour of amber. And some of them are sensitive to a particular low sound, a particular high sound. They've all got particularities because of their electricity. And our memories get stored in many of these according to what is particular about it. So, for example, you might be walking down a path and you smell a rose. And I'll show you how it gets stored, that memory. So, it gets stored, the smell of the rose is the memory, and it's stored in this neuron, and it's just a smell. It's a particular smell. Okay, but the experience of walking down the path and smelling the rose gets stored in many, many, many neurons. And interestingly, it's not the only thing that's stored in that neuron. There are a whole lot of memories about smells in each of those neurons, and these memories are stored in an overlapping way, I suppose like fish scales. And that means that when you pull that memory out, it comes with something that's connected with it. For example, say one of these neurons, its particularity was crispness. Just say that. And so you think of walking across a frosty path, and somehow you think, why did that connect with the crispness of an apple? So it's sometimes drawing a metaphor from our minds is just like reportage. We're not inventing it. It's just that it happens to be stored here in the neuron that specialised in crispness. So, okay, so our memories are stored in all these neurons. I should have drawn hundreds of thousands, but anyway. So, when we create, what happens is that each moment of our memory activates a whole lot of neurons. A whole lot of neurons. Some more, the closer ones, more so. The more distant ones, less so. And more relevant memories get activated, and less relevant memories get activated. But any experience stirs many, many neurons. Okay, so that's part of the architecture of our brains and why we can be surprised, astounded by a thought that seems to come out of the blue. It's not out of the blue. It's just that neurons were stirred that we weren't expecting. Okay, so how do we stir so many neurons? Is there a way to stir a lot more? Yes, and that's the sort of thinking that I was talking about in video 3, which is about associative thinking. So if you go into the stillness that I was talking about there by open meditation, as described by Colzato in 2014, where you just empty your mind, stop the chatter, just let your mind be empty, then what happens, as Martindale said in 1975 in his fundamental, really important experiment between creative and non-creative people, is that creative people spontaneously know how to go into that stillness. However, if you're not already creative, you can learn a tactic, and the tactic is open meditation. So when you go into that stillness, Martindale showed that not only do you connect, your brain connects with really remote neurons, really remote associations, which means you get unexpected thoughts, which everyone thinks are very creative, and you find very creative. But what happens is your brain becomes open to all sorts of stimuli. You take in a whole lot of experience that you are hardly aware of. Things you barely recognize, half sense, half hear, things that flood into your mind. Now what I think of it is like, I'll do 2 bottles, so over here. So when you have this really open mind because of the stillness, it's like a jar rather than a bottle, and stimuli is flooding in the arrows, flooding in, a rich flood of experience. However, if you try to create from a very, very different place, if you try to use the usual analytic thinking, the sort of thinking that is rational and sensible, it has your values, it has a sense of purpose, it has a sense of prediction, what happens is, according to Martindale, I'm going to draw a very narrow net bottle. Now, a lot less stimuli can get in here than here. So you just get a small amount of stimuli and you don't have all this wealth of associations. So while this is very good for rational analytic thinking and is why civilization has got us here, it's totally useless for creative thinking because you need these rich associations in your memory because creativity depends on the architecture of memory. So Arne Dietrich, one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, says that it's a matter of resources. So our analytic thinking, our sensible, rational thinking, the housing our values and attitudes, is in the prefrontal cortex. I talked about this in video 1. So it's here. An enormous amount of energy in the brain goes into keeping this prefrontal cortex, this marvelous part of our brain, going. So he says that creative people use the resources differently. So they shut down part of the prefrontal cortex, and that gives enormous energy to the rest of their brain. So their thoughts can go anywhere, way out, to the furthest association, and link a whole lot of things. So if you go over here, so being in that state of stillness, you will get far richer associations because you're connecting all these neurons. And what's more, every thought will stimulate another thought which will stimulate more neurons. So you've got this huge number of associations, of connections of neurons, connections of memory. So your thoughts will go anywhere. You've got a very rich resource. So what's the difference with associative thinking and mind wandering? It seems that for creative people, their imagination, their imaginings are far more vivid than mind wandering. And this happens particularly so where people have been doing it for a long time, although not always so. You can do it on your first work, creative work. But some people say perhaps you need 10 years because you've got to learn to trust this sort of thinking. It's said that, for example, that mathematicians, and I know this anecdotally, although I haven't seen research on it, and mathematicians see their mathematical objects as real things, not as abstractions like you and I might think. We might think numbers and figures are just abstractions. To them, they're real. And I know this is true of writers. because there's been very interesting research back in 2002 about experienced writers, and 92% of experienced writers actually experience their characters as so real that they hear them and see them. And quite often the characters insist on what they want in the novel. So, for example, J.K. Rowling wanted to make Harry Potter into a girl, Harriet Potter. But she struggled for 6 months. But Harriet Potter didn't work, and Harry Potter ended up winning the battle. She also said that her characters come in and sit on her bed and tell her what they want. They even tell her how to live her life. There's Sara Paretsky, the detective novelist. So she had a character who she wanted to put in jail and torture. And the character refused to do this until she was promised true love. Alice Walker in The Colour Purple has two characters who go through terrible times. And she was very upset about them, and they came into her bedroom and said to her, look, don't have such a long face. We got through it in the end. It happened to me. I was on my third novel. I had this character who I thought was a writer, and one day there was a creak on the stairs, and he walked into my writing room, and he had a satchel on his back, and I saw sheets of writing on it. And then I looked closer, and it was sheet music. And it was most unexpected, because he was a stutterer, but he was a great singer. So the mind gives us all these rich associations. And what we have to do is learn to stop thinking about what we're doing and our purpose, and use that anticipatory part of our brain. We have to close that down, close the chatter, close all our sense of purpose, and just let the creation happen of its own accord, and trust in the marvelous architecture of our brains.